Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by also acknowledging the people of this country. It is an honour and a privilege to be among you, and if I may greet you in our language, tēnā koutou, te hau kāinga, nei tēnei tētahi mokapono Ngāti Kahungunu me Ngāti Porou e mihi atu nei. Ko koutou ngā rangatira o tēnei whenua tapu, ko koutou ngā kaitiaki o tēnei whenua tapu. Nō reira tēnā tātou. Kia koutou ngā hoa whanaunga no Aotearoa, Juan, Rob, koutou ko Moana Roa, he tino kaha rātu ko te ngākau e kiti atu ia koutou. Nō reira huri no tēnā tātou. I'd like to begin, if I may, with a change to the program. You'll see my presentation is labelled Prison Abolition and Self-Determination, which is what I'm going to talk about, but that title is there because Juan was putting me under pressure to give a title. I actually think titles are really important to presentations. When I was at law school a long time ago, one of the non-law subjects I chose to do for some reason was English, and we studied two plays that year. There was William Shakespeare's King Lear, which was about a mad English king stumbling around the moors, cursing his family, and the second play was Christopher Marlowe's Edward II, about another mad English king who got into trouble because he was having an affair with his page boy. The only thing I learned from those two plays is that nothing much has changed in the British royal family. But I handed in my assignment on the two plays, and it came back with that dreaded note from my lecturer, "Please come and see me." And underneath that he'd written in red, "What is your title?" And I thought he must have been confusing me with Lord Jackson or something. But when I met with him, he explained that he wanted us to give our assignments titles because they give some indication of what your talk is going to be. So while Prison Abolition and Self-Determination certainly indicates what I hope to talk about today, the other title I'd like to give it sums up perhaps the main threads upon which I want to base my discussion, and that is, so the new title is A Charlatan, Two Grandchildren and a Hero. And I hope as I proceed through my talk that the choice of that title will become clear. The charlatan that I refer to is a man well known in New Zealand, an early coloniser, whose name was Elsden Best, who made a reputation for himself by becoming a self-styled expert on our people, on our lives, on the things that we felt were important, and most importantly on the deficiencies in our humanity which made us inferior and therefore needing to be colonised. And in one of the many books that he wrote, he said at one stage, one of the problems with Māori people, as it is indeed with all native peoples, is that they're not given much to thinking. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Because one of the difficulties that we face, I think, in criminology is that Elsden Best's presumption that Indigenous peoples do not have an intellectual tradition. We do not have an ability to think for ourselves, to make our own decisions, to work out what is best for us, and that can only be done for us by others, by colonisers who have come to take over our lands, lives and power. And it seems to me that if we are going to find any value in a notion of criminology, then for Indigenous peoples it must be based in an Indigenous philosophy. It must be based within an Indigenous intellectual tradition. And one of the reasons I say that is because when they dismissed our intellectual tradition, they also dismissed how we understood the world. What constituted a good life in our world, what constituted things that were seen as contrary to the good life, and how we dealt with damage done to the good life within our intellectual tradition. They dismissed as primitive and unthinking the whole notion of the worth of human life and how order and harmony could be maintained within human societies. And one of the many things that did, among the many violent things that colonisation does, is in destroying any belief in an Indigenous belief system, in an Indigenous intellectual tradition. It destroyed the faith that Indigenous peoples have in themselves. And if you take away the faith and belief that people have in themselves, then you begin the process of traumatic dispossession. And part of the struggle of decolonisation, for me at home, is re-Māorification, is re-indigenisation, is to reassure our people that we are worthy humans, that we are intellectually capable, that we have a deep and abiding intellectual tradition, to reassure our people that we are worthy of having faith in ourselves. And one other thing that colonisation has done, and why I often quote that comment of the charlatan Elston Best, is that in destroying our faith in ourselves, it also imposed upon us views of the worth and value of those who had come to dispossess us. And so I was interested with the question before about settler colonialism. The term settler is a euphemism, it's a lie. Colonisation is necessarily a violent, brutal process of dispossession. And when colonisers chose to call themselves settlers, it was to hide or to mask the reality of how they found a new place to live, far away from their homes, how they sought to justify dispossessing people who had done them no harm. And it ignored the fact, of course, that if they were to become settlers, they necessarily unsettled the people to whom the land belonged. And so part of reclaiming that faith in ourselves is to reclaim and disabuse the language that has been used and continues to be used by the colonisers. And part of that, to me also, is understanding what criminologists and others call the Indigenous criminal problem. As Juan mentioned, I was involved in a rather large research project to look at a Māori analysis of why so many of our people were in prison, what our people thought of the imposed criminal justice system. I always gag a bit when I say criminal justice because I think it's a contradiction in terms. But that was a while ago, and we're now trying to work through an update on that original piece of research to see if anything has in fact changed. And nothing has, really. If we just look at two statistics, for example, in the 1980s, when we began the research, the male prison population, 51% of the male prison population in New Zealand was Māori men. And today that rate is still about the same, over 52% of the prison population, male, is Māori men. In the 1980s, in the female prison population, the Māori percentage of female prisoners was 3%. That is the only thing that has changed, because the percentage of Māori women now in prison has jumped from 3% to 64%. And that has neither caused shock nor outrage among people at home. It is just part of the accepted behaviour of the violent Māori, the violent savage, who still lurks beneath the veneer of civilisation which colonisation has tried to place upon us. So understanding the impact of colonisation, the effect of the redefining of who we are by people such as Elsden Best and other ethnographic trappers who continue to tell us what is best for us, we can begin to look anew at how to deal with the tragedy of so many of our people in prison. Which brings me to the next part of my title, which is 2 grandchildren. One will know that I sometimes get obsessively proud about my grandchildren. I think there are no more beautiful, intelligent, bright people in the world. I exercise my grandfatherly privilege to spoil them whenever I can, but I learn so much from them. And one of the many issues we are trying to deal with at home at the moment is that the government is reintroducing what we are calling the new stolen generation policy at home. After a long struggle in the early 1990s, our people had inserted in social welfare policy a provision that if a Māori child was for some reason in need of care and protection, then that Māori child should be placed with a Māori family. A couple of months ago, the government decided that it was going to do away with that policy and reintroduce the right of the state to determine when they can take Māori children and to whom they will place those Māori children. And in the 2 months since the announcement of that policy, they have begun a process of what we are calling preemptive taking, where Māori women who are seen to be at risk or a potential problem are having their children taken from them at birth. So that's a typical colonising control mechanism. It happened here in Australia, it happened in Canada, the United States, and it continues to happen. So we've been holding a number of meetings around the country to try and develop a strategy about how to deal with that, how to become disruptive. I really like that term. And I was on the phone talking to the organisers of one of those meetings, and one of my grandchildren was sitting by me, and when I'd finished the conversation, she said, "Oh, what's this meeting about?" And I explained it to her, and then I said, it may just be that our people again are having to bang our heads against another brick wall. And she's 6 years old, and she looked up at me and said, "Why don't you just walk around the wall?" And so for me, part of dealing with the incarceration of Māori, and I would hope other Indigenous peoples, is that rather than continue to bang our head against the brick wall, which is the imposed criminal system, we seek a way to walk around it. And to do that, we need to reclaim that faith in ourselves, to reclaim the understanding of what it is to be Māori, to be Indigenous wherever we live. Round about the same time, another one of my granddaughters was with me, and when I grew up I was lucky. I had a koro, a grandfather who was a great storyteller, and I tried to hand on to my grandchildren what he gave me, and the belief that you can learn so much through stories, and the belief that there are stories in the land, that no matter where you go in the land there are stories, and they are there waiting for you if you care to listen. And we were back home where I grew up and staying on our land, and I took this particular grandchild for a walk to show her a really special place in our history, which is a little pool on the banks of a river. It's a separate little pool where the water is so clear on a sunny day it shimmers like a mirror, and so you can see your reflection really clearly in the water. And we call it waimarama, which has two meanings. Wai is water, marama means to shed light. So marama is our word for explanation, how to explain something. And marama is also our word for the moon. So it's like the light of the moon on the water. And our people believe that if you look into that water and you see your reflection, then you can imagine whatever you want to be. You can dream whatever dream you want, and the water will take your dream and help you make it become a reality. So I was explaining this to my granddaughter, and when we walked back she was quiet for a while, and then she said, well, we could imagine we could change the world, couldn't we? And I said, yes, my baba, we could. And so part of dealing with the issue of Māori and indeed Indigenous peoples in prison is for me to imagine a different world. And that necessarily means, in the end, for me and for our people, I believe, a world in which prisons no longer exist. On all empirical data, prisons fail. They do not rehabilitate, except in a tiny majority of cases where the factors leading to rehabilitation were probably already present. They certainly do not act as a deterrent, another supposed aim of incarceration. So on those empirical grounds alone, prisons don't work. And yet there is such a vested interest in the reality of prisons. Hundreds of research projects have been done at home, and I'm sure there have been hundreds done here in Australia, suggesting changes to the prison system. But nothing changes, nothing alters. They still have the same failure rate. More importantly, they still have the same potential to crush the humanity of people who are sentenced to them. And so if we are to imagine a world in which the full humanity and potential of Indigenous peoples is realised once more, then the removal of incarceration, the removal of prisons, is fundamental to that, it seems to me. Which brings me to the fourth thread of my new title, a hero. I think it's important to have heroes. I have lots of heroes. When I was thinking about this on the plane coming here, I realised lots of my heroes are women, and one of them is a woman I'm sure you've heard of, Angela Davis, who, as you will know, is not just a long-term advocate of prison abolition, but I think one of the greatest intellectuals alive today. And she said in a speech once that the fundamental question is, why do we take prisons for granted? Why do we see them as a given, as if there is no other possibility? And so what I'd finally like to talk about is take that heroic statement and talk about why indeed do we take prisons for granted, and what can we do about changing that state of mind. Even in Western Europe, where prisons originated, they are of comparatively recent vintage. No Indigenous society that I'm aware of had a concept of imprisonment. In our language back home, we have no word for prison. The idea that you could lock away someone who may have done harm, lock that person away from those he or she had harmed, lock them away from the potential community within which he or she could offer remorse, could seek reconciliation, was culturally incomprehensible. And because it was culturally incomprehensible, we couldn't even find a word for it when the colonisers came and started building prisons. And they started building prisons, of course, not for the same reasons exactly that they had built them in Europe, but as a specific part of the colonising process of control. That if we cannot kill all Indigenous peoples, although colonisation had a good shot at trying to do that wherever it went, then we must find other ways to control them. We must criminalise the normality of being Indigenous and then lock them away. And so I often say that you cannot look at a young Indigenous man or a young Indigenous woman in a prison cage and try to understand them in isolation from the trauma of the history which has shaped them and their people. That prisons exist in colonising states as part of colonisation. And if we are to decolonise, then we have to decarcerate. If we are going to remove the oppression of colonisation, we have to remove the oppression of imprisonment. But what would we replace it with? And how do we answer questions that are commonly asked if you raise the question of prison abolition? What about the murderers and the rapists and so on? Well, to remove prisons, you have to remove what I call the dichotomy of the prison mindset. You have to remove the belief that prison is the only way to deal with wrong. And where Indigenous peoples, I think, have lessons to teach the rest of the world, among many other lessons, where Indigenous peoples can teach others lessons is that for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples dealt with harm in ways that never envisaged imprisonment. Harm occurred in Indigenous communities. We were not infallible, we were not perfect. We were prone to anger, we were prone to hurting people. But we found ways to deal with that which recognised the collectivity within which we lived, which recognised the land upon which we lived. And so at home, if a person committed harm against another one, that harm was not seen as an act done against some omnipotent institution called the state. It was seen as harm done to the relationships of which that person was a part. And so, say, if a man assaulted a woman, then the harm done was not just by the man to that victim woman, but by the man to himself, to the collective to which he belonged, to the collective to which the victim belonged, and the wider collective of which they were a part. And so at home, when a wrong was done, the question asked was never, do you plead guilty or not guilty? We have no word for guilty in our language either. Rather, the question was, do you know who you have harmed? And if you begin from that question, do you know who you have harmed? Then the process through which you work to address the harm is quite different than if you begin with the question, do you plead guilty or not guilty? And if that notion of do you know who you have harmed ties that collective to the land, So the Indigenous peoples do not call themselves people of the land because it's a poetic statement, but because it's a reality. If you damaged an individual person and the collective of which they are a part, then you also damaged what we would call the sacredness or the tapu of the land upon which that collective lived. And so to redress the harm involved a long process of rebuilding the relationships which had been damaged by the harm that was caused. And it seems to me that the first step to decarceration then is to talk about a different way of understanding why people cause harm and what the effects of that harm are. Now, the pressures upon people today, and particularly the pressures upon Indigenous peoples, are quite different to what they were before colonisation, because we are having to deal with the overarching and greater harm of colonisation, which becomes what I call a historic associative cause of harm. But the fact that the situation is more complex does not, in my view, negate the values which underpinned that Indigenous way of understanding harm, why harm is done, and how harm can be remedied. And as my grandchild said, all it does is take some imagination to think through how that might function in the 21st century. To think through how can we rebuild a sense of collectivity within a society, how can we rebuild an awareness of the land, the stories in the land, and the collectives of people who live upon the land. And so for me, abolition of prisons then is not just an inherently Indigenous thing to desire. I think it's a positive human thing to desire as well. Because it's my view that prisons don't work for anyone. But to close the prisons tomorrow is, of course, impractical. And we have to begin the much harder, much longer, and much more difficult process of talking to people about why harm is done and how harm might be addressed. And it is in that journey that I encourage Indigenous peoples to reclaim that faith in ourselves, to not accept that the current way of dealing with wrongdoing is the only way, to accept that we can somehow indigenize prisons, can somehow make prisons consistent with who we are and how we see the world, but rather be brave enough to imagine something different, to walk around the wall rather than continually bang our head against it. And to do that, I guess, like being a disruptor or an activist, does take a certain courage. But for me, Indigenous peoples have had to be courageous simply to survive. And often being courageous just means taking a deep breath before embarking on a difficult course of action. And it seems to me that we cannot go on as Indigenous peoples accepting prisons as the reality. They are the most vicious and oppressive expression of colonisation. And in the research that we're trying to do to update the earlier work at home, we're now able, which we weren't able to do in the 1980s, to compare the situation in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States, where the figures comparatively are the same. the situations are comparatively the same in terms of incarceration and so on. And so that raises one of two possible questions. One, does it mean that Indigenous peoples in New Zealand, Australia, Canada and the United States are born inherently criminogenic? Like the pathetic assumption a few years ago that Indigenous peoples had a warrior gene. Is there some violent gene within Indigenous peoples that make us commit harm? Some colonisers, some white racists might think that is so, but it is clearly fatuous. The second question, however, is what do the Indigenous peoples in New Zealand, Australia, Canada and the United States share in common? Besides a common love of the land, we share a history of being dispossessed by people from somewhere else. We share a history of trauma which is yet to be resolved. And so it is in dealing with that trauma of colonisation that eventually we get to the point of prison abolition, of decarceration. That we reach the point where we can begin to imagine, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for everyone, a better way of dealing with the frailties of humanity, really. The reality is that humans won't always live perfect lives. That harm will be caused. But if we reach that point, then we also reach the point of removing some of those historic causative factors which sadly shape or misshape the lives of too many Indigenous peoples. So I guess what I wanted to say in coming today, partly because Juan asked me, and as he said, we've had a long relationship. I've seen him grow and develop from a young, useless rugby player to a fine man and certainly a very good academic. So it was nice to come on his invitation. But also the opportunity just to talk with people, and especially Indigenous peoples, who share common issues but also have common ambitions and dreams for our grandchildren. And I'd like, if I may, just to close with one rather long story, and it's a story about another one of my grandchildren. One of our iwi, one of our tribal groups at home, is called Ngāti Awa. And they have a very important ancestor who is a woman called Wairaka. And when they sailed across the Pacific on their waka or their canoe, which they called Mātātua, and landed on the coast of our land, the waka was hit by a storm. And Wairaka, this young woman, took control of the canoe and guided it safely through the storm to shore. And so at the small coastal town of Whakatane in the Bay of Plenty, where she brought the waka ashore, on the rocks at the heads of the harbour, there is now a statue of Wairaka. And it's a very stylised statue. So she's sort of standing like this, leaning into the wind and into the waves. And we were at the beach one day, and my grandchildren were playing in the shallows, and then one of them jumped on a little rock and called out to me, "Koro, look," and she stood like this, like Wairaka on the rock. And then later I exercised one of my, as I said, grandfather privileges, and I took them for a health treat to McDonald's. And they were in the playground, she climbed on top of the slide and she went, "Look," and she stood like Wairaka again. And when we got home, she rushed into her mother, and I heard her saying, "Mum, look," and she went like that. And when we went to bed that night, we were swapping stories, and she wanted to hear the story about Wairaka again, so I told her. And when I'd finished telling her, I said, "You really like Wairaka, don't you?" She said, "Yes, she's my hero." And I said, "Why is she your hero?" She said, "Because she was brave." I said, "Yes, she certainly was brave. Why else is she your hero?" And she jumped on top of the bed and she went like this and said, "Because she was free." We don't talk about freedom much, but if colonisation is anything, it is the denial of Indigenous peoples to freely be who they are, to imagine who they may become, to chart whatever storms, to imagine whatever future they wish to imagine. So for me to speak of prison abolition is also to speak of freeing Indigenous peoples, for acknowledging at long last, after it has been denied for so long, the full humanity of who we are. So if you are a criminologist, if you are a health worker, whatever you are, if you can see decarceration, the abolition of prisons, as the ultimate removal of colonisation and thus the freeing of millions of Indigenous peoples, then you will be, certainly to my granddaughter, a hero. I wish you well in that quest. Kia ora.
Questions, please. Yes.
So thank you very much for your talk. It was fascinating. The whole thing is complicated by the fact that harm is not an objectivity. Who causes harm, and if it's a harm at all in the first place? The prisons of Israel, of the state of Israel, are full of indigenous Palestinians who cause no harm but resisting harm. They are there because they try to resist harm by the state. That makes the going around the world a bit more complicated.
Okay. Did you hear that?
Basically, when he, correct me if I'm wrong, he was talking about one of the issues we have is that harm isn't objective. And he was talking about how the difficulty sometimes, he gave the example of the fact that in the Israeli state imprisoning so many Palestinians who have done no harm except to resist, which demonstrates that how the difficulty sometimes of going around that wall. Is that fair?
I don't think it's in the bio, but I've just returned from some work as part of a human rights monitoring group in Gaza. I think states are, in many ways, the greatest criminals. Certainly colonising states are criminal states, in my view. But part of the power they take is to define what harm is. And what they do is never harmful. That's what people do to the state, and that's why I like some of the definitions you had of the way criminologists tend to view things and others. There is, as I said, though, that human reality, and just talking about crime, that humans do have that capacity to hurt each other. I think we should work in our communities and in our lives to minimise and prevent that harm, but there will be occasions when humans do hurt each other. And what every society, certainly that I'm aware of, has developed is its own way of defining that, of working out how to deal with that, and most importantly, to repair the harm that has been done. Locking someone away in a cage does not repair the harm that he or she may have done. And so one of the things certainly that many Indigenous societies do is they contextualise that, as I said, in the notion of relationships. And so harm is done to that wider group of relationships. There is some work being done around what's sometimes called restorative justice, which certainly at home is a corruption of Māori dispute resolution processes. But the way in which restorative justice is often defined in Western criminal jurisdictions is a contradiction in terms, because it doesn't address the overarching harm that the state does. It says, you've done some harm, you naughty person, we'll restore that, but we'll continue harming you, we'll continue taking your land or whatever. But I think any human society aims for harm minimisation, and that may well be, in the state of current human evolution, the best we can do. But one of the interesting things that research shows that flies in the face of many perceptions about the violent, savage Indigenous peoples and so on, is that there's clear evidence in many pre-colonising Indigenous societies that things like domestic violence were actually unknown, things like child abuse were not known, and so there is a possibility to reclaim a way of understanding human relationships in which those things do not happen. That was a rather long answer, I'm sorry.
Yes, Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm from the law school at...
Can I come a bit closer? Sorry.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Thank you. It was really lovely to hear the way that you spoke about these things and made sense of a prison to us. I spend a lot of time thinking about abolition of prisons from a different point of view, which I would like to have an opportunity to talk to you about at some point in time. But I wanted to ask you, whenever I engage with people who are for the prison, and you work through all of the reasons, because there is never a reason for a prison. There's nothing rational about it. It always comes down to a point where they're not prepared to give up the punishment. They want to punish. And from my point of view, that's about remaining in a state of unforgiveness. And I was just wondering if you could make a comment about that.
I think if people are hurt, then they want some recognition of that hurt. And the way Western societies seem to have dealt with that is that the state on your behalf will exact punishment for your hurt. And the punitive impulse runs really deep, I think, in Western society. And it's manifested itself in all sorts of different ways through the centuries. The feuds and bloodletting between different Christian sects were very punitive. I will punish you for not being true to the word of the Christian God, and so on. So there's that very punitive streak that I think is linked to the patriarchy and misogyny, the treatment of women in Western society has historically been punitive. The fact that women in Western society had no rights at law for centuries and were chattels, property to be owned by men. And so if a woman stepped out of line, if a woman asserted some modicum of independence, then she was dealt with really punitively because she was threatening the accepted order. And so the idea of that chair is my property and I get angry with the chair, I can smash it. If that woman is my property and I get angry with her, I can smash her. And so it was a threat to the established patriarchal order. And so I think there are lots of layers in why that punitive streak developed. I don't think it's necessarily a streak that is innate in humans. There's a reaction to being hurt, but even in a non-prison society, there would be a process of sanction for harm. There had to be a way in which people could have the relationships restored, but the hurt felt by the one who was wronged also has to be assuaged in some way as well. But to say that prison is the answer to that is a nonsense. Prison doesn't assuage that hurt. If you've ever seen a rape victim in court and the way she's treated in court, she is simply re-victimised. So there's a fallacy in that argument. I think in the end what it comes down to, because prisons have become such an accepted part of the way Western societies run, to remove it is seen as a threat to the established order. Goodness, Western civilization will collapse if we don't have prisons. Well, indigenous peoples existed for hundreds of years without prisons, and the world did not collapse. So I think probably the way to handle that argument is just to talk about it. Let's talk about how things could be different, and then sort of get to the prison abolition bit at the end, rather than start with prison abolition and then try to find reasons. That might be a way perhaps to go. Did that sort of answer?
Anyone? Yes, Becca.
Yes, I'd like to follow up on the various question about forgiveness as a response to harm. This is the argument of Desmond Tutu in the book of Forgiving, where he argues that the people of South Africa have apparently forgiven the unforgivable, the way people of African descent have forgiven the harm of slavery. They're not looking for revenge or punishment, same way as indigenous people in Australia and New Zealand are not really looking for harm to be done to the invaders or settlers as a way of addressing their suffering. Tutu argues that when you forgive, you're empowering yourself. You are freeing yourself from the hold of the resentment. So it might be a part of the project of freedom if we rediscover the capacity and the ability to forgive rather than seek to punish or to get a revenge every time we suffer harm. I wonder what you think about it.
At home, and I know among many Indigenous peoples that there's a notion of balance, that things have to be in balance, the male and female elements have to be in balance and so on. And it's the same when wrong is done, that forgiveness has to be balanced by contrition. That if there's no contrition, if there's no remorse, there cannot be forgiveness. And so part of the process of mending the harm is to ensure those two things happened. Otherwise you'll have one side being all forgiving and the other side think, oh, I'll do it again. You know, so that's the challenge of a reconciliation process really, is that both sides reach a place where they can come together. But those two things have to happen, I think. It's a bit like lots of governments now are issuing apologies for what happened in the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. The government at home is apologising every week to Māori people, but nothing changes. You know? Oh, we're so sorry for taking all your land. We're not going to give it back, but gee, we're sorry. You know, it's a nonsense. Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. Oh yes.
I have one comment, and it's just because the phrase was haunting me so much. I was at attended the Sisters Inside conference.
Say it again,
The Sisters Inside conference, and one of the speakers there, Vicky Roach, she defined Australia as a big open-air prison, and it sort of resonated with that idea, and I just wanted to share that phrase with you, so you might want to utilize it.
Are there any other?
Can I just respond to the idea of the open-air prison? Because you may know that concentration camps, for example, weren't invented by Adolf Hitler. They were invented by the colonisers. The first concentration camps were built in the United States and then in New Zealand. And the aim was to concentrate the natives so they could be more easily controlled. And it was then a very short step from concentrating them in one place to incarcerating them in another place. So, yeah, I like that phrase, an open-air prison. It's good. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Incredible insights and value of what you've shared. Within the Pacific, my awareness is that some of the decolonised, and I say that very loosely, some of the smaller island states have progressed significantly in terms of building community rather than incarceration. So I think it's Samoa, every prisoner goes home on the weekend. Some of the smaller states, the prisons are actually empty because the strength is in the community and in the kinship and in the reconciliation processes where the restoring and the repairing of harm is of greater value than the removal.
I think colonisation was the same wherever it occurred. It had the same purpose, but I often think that if a country was small enough so the Indigenous population was never outnumbered, in many ways it became easier for that Indigenous peoples to hold on to the things that were important to them. Couldn't hold on to their power because the state just crushed that. But if the country was big enough and lots of colonisers could come to settle, then it became much harder for the Indigenous people simply in being swamped with numbers. And the great testament for me to Indigenous peoples in Australia or Canada or wherever is that in spite of all that we survived, and that we haven't lost the things that we were taught we should lose. And that's the great hope, I think, that we have.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to end it. Sorry, I'm going to end it now. If it's okay, yeah? So would you all please join me in thanking. Is that right? Yeah, that was
beautiful.